This discussion is a practical discussion. We're in chapter 18, the summary or repeat, or we can say the highest teaching. We've come to the summit, and the highest teaching is the teaching of renunciation. And the discussion has to do with what to renounce and how to renounce. And the discussion we've been having, so we're at, in terms of the shloka, we're at right now, chapter 18, shloka 17, which we'll read again here in a moment. And there's a question that comes that it may not even arise consciously, but it's here nonetheless, even if not asked. The discussion we've been having here, we're going to go back to 14:15 and just read this shloka. And we've been having fun with this. But they're 14 and 15. We'll reread. Speaking of action and who's doing, and what is being done here. So Lord Krishna says, the seed of action, which is the 13. Now, Arjuna, I'll teach you the 5 constituents. What's constituent mean?
Parts of. Parts.
Parts of. Yeah, very good. Participants, also, you could say like that. But constituents, agents as well, like that. Okay. I'll teach you the 5 constituents that, according to the wisdom teachings, welcome. Which, according to the wisdom teachings, make every action happen. So every action that occurs. Please, Maharaj, join us. Have a seat. So now the 5. The seed of action, which is the body, is the first. So seed of action, what does that mean? Where the action's happening. Seed of the body. Seed of action, which is the body. And then the ego, which is the agent of action. So what does agent mean?
Instigator.
Instigator is a very good way to relate to that, agent. And then the sense organs. So we consider the sense organs in the teachings. It doesn't just mean the 5 senses where we relate to world, but also the organs of action, the 5 organs of action. So it's 10. It's not that there are 10 senses, there are 5 senses and 5 organs of action. So 5 inward facing, as it were, where we observe the impulses from the world, and then the 5 outgoing, as it were, where we act with the world. So relationship coming in, world impetus, and going out, action in the world. Feet, hands, the voice, and then the excretory functions and the sexual organs, sexual functions. So those are the 5 organs of action, and the 5 senses we should be clear on. So these are involved in action. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the actual functioning of the body and mind that perform the actions. So the actual functioning of the mind, the actual functioning of the body, and then the various aspects of God that correspond with different parts of the body. Now, I heard the discussion yesterday on the term God, and, the words themselves are actually neutral. We could say higher vibration, lower vibration. The words themselves are neutral. A word doesn't have any independent meaning. It only has the meaning that we as an individual mental faculty ascribe to it. So a word like God will make someone feel separate? No, but the conditioning will, right? And that's non-judgmental. It's just the way it is. It's the way it is. So the word love might make someone feel union, but only based upon their own experience with it. So if they had lived in a household where the father every morning said, "I'm going to love you now," and came down and molested the child, then hearing the word love would not bring a feeling of union. So the words themselves are neutral. It's only what we intone in them that has meaning from an individual perspective. And of course, there's not actually an individual, but we're working with it. We're working with it. This is what we're doing. We're working with it in order to understand, and that's the discussion here. So, and then the deity, God or aspect, and we had some very good discussion about this, and we'll just come back to the motherhood because it's a very helpful way to see how it is that a deity is in charge of something, a function, yes, and is actually the underlying power of it. Yes? You can see that. Okay. And I feel like we can all, even though we might not have direct experience with it, we can all relate to that in a way. Yes?
Could that mean the deity is the doer?
You have to listen carefully to what's being shared. Okay. So it's not the instigator.
No.
Who's the instigator?
Ego.
So then, yes, you can say the deity is the doer more than the ego is the doer. And you can say that the senses, organs of action, and the incoming senses are part of the doing, correct?
Yes.
They're constituents in the doing. Yeah. And the body also is involved in the doing. Yeah. And the functions within the body that are involved are also, yeah?
Doing.
Okay. So all of that is doing. Ego's not actually doing. But it's the agent of the doing. It's that, as it were, that's bidding the action to happen. That's calling it forward. And we're going to do our hand thing here again in a moment to see if we can see it.
Can I share something about
that?
Yes. My impression is that the motherhood instinct is like it's kind of like welling up from within.
Yes.
And then we talk a lot about how we have, all the things that we want to lose, and that are obscuring the truth.
Yes.
And so to me, it feels like the motherhood instinct is underneath. And if I have a lot of thoughts and things obscuring it, sometimes it doesn't come out as much.
Beautiful.
Because I can't come into that peaceful, energetic state where I'm really sort of radiating that love to Tao.
Absolutely. That is absolutely perfect. That explanation is perfect. Yes, that's happening, right? It seems to be. So now that instinct is that deity, the presiding deity. It is the presiding deity. It's alive. More alive than what we imagine to be ourselves. Far more alive than what we take ourselves to be. Yes? And by the way, you call it an instinct, but it's completely adaptive to the situation, isn't it? So we could say even an intuitive, not instinctive behavior. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you'd be closer to the mark. So you call it an instinct, but it's not. Instincts are learned behaviors. Mm-hmm. But this is not acting. It's acting, not reacting. Yes? It's acting, not reacting. It's very much, in that way, you could say conscious or aware. Yes? So deity, living, life, deity, of the one life. So, and you see that the stuff that could cover it, thoughts, but thoughts that are bid or called forth or identified with by the ego sense.
And fears and
Very specifically, yeah, all of this. Okay. So now, Timothy, sometimes, and we've been doing this a fair amount when we talk about this, but if you just take your hand for a moment, we can all do it. We can all see it again, but just take your hand, and if you lift it up and then turn it, look at it, you can look at it, and then you can put it back down. Now, in this case, you could say this voice was the instigator. You could say like that. But also within you is some compliance with that. So you could also say, I instigated that. But the rest of that, what did you do?
I followed the instigation.
Yeah. But you moved the muscles yourself. You're aware of moving the muscles. And are they your muscles? You designed them? You created them? No. And are you actually aware of the individual muscle movements, and are you commanding them?
Unconscious.
That's an assumption. That's an assumption. That's a conditioned notion, conditioned idea. Right? Truth of the situation is you don't know.
Oh.
And all of those factors, which are being discussed here, are universal. So you instigate, as it were, and you call forth thought about moving, universal factor. And you call forth the organ of action, the hands, to move. You bid it. You ask it to move. And that's a universal function. The function of it is universal. You didn't design it. You didn't develop it. You didn't make it. You didn't draft the blueprints of it. You don't know about the laws under which it functions. You didn't develop them. And the actual movement of it itself, the flow of the prana, the flow of the energy, the life force, in order to do this, you don't have a clue. It's good news. It's good news. There's no animosity or anything in this. Just look at it and see. So what this is helping us to see is, you say I did, we say I did, but you didn't. You played a role, as it were, from the ego sense, which is you called forth, as it were, action. And that calling forth is a mental function, isn't it? So I think you're aware of a thought, and then seeing that it functions according to the thought. You say somehow inside, turn towards me, and it turns towards you, right? And then now turn back, and now go back down. And so you have a role in it. The role, interestingly enough, if you can see it, is agent. Right? Agent. And the rest of it is mysterious. And then if you can imagine, and we work with this too, you can imagine that now you have a weight on that hand. And there's a book on the top of the hand, or a heavy book. And now you're going to do. So again, you're the agent, you're calling it forward. And of course, it will take more pressure. And you can think about waking up in the morning. There could be a lot of sleepiness, but you say to yourself, no, we're going to get up anyway. And so it's expression of will, individual will, expression of will, and a question of power in the will, People who've had hands paralyzed, they work with it. And what are they working with? They're working with the same factor, calling it forth. And if you see, you focus your awareness on it more and more. And you strengthen the power of will. And then maybe it will move. Or maybe it won't. And so you're expressing will, but there's also finally a universal will, this deity, which is actually underlying the action and whether the action occurs or not. So you can say, my will, God's will, like that. My will, God's will. My will, but God's will is done, like this. So, now, here's the point that we wanted to discuss a little bit this morning, which is a seeming nuance, and that is, okay, if I'm not doing anything, if nature is doing, then it doesn't make any difference what I do. I don't have a role in it anyway. This can be a very persistent thought. It can be devilish. I'm not even the thinker. From a limited perspective, I'm not even the thinker. Even the thoughts are universal, and they're welling up from a universal factor. So I could say, well, I didn't do it. What's called spiritual bypassing. I didn't do it. I'm not the one who did it. You told me, Swami, I didn't do it. So I didn't do it. And then the question about if we have some power, what to do or what not to do. There's in the 13th chapter, there is there's this 13:22, which is very much related and what we wanted to come back and cover. Let's do that. Let's do this one. The Supreme Soul in this body, this is in the 13th discourse, the Supreme Soul in this body is also called the spectator, the permitter, the supporter, the enjoyer, the great Lord, and the Supreme Self. This is speaking of the I, the highest within us. Or we could say God. Sometimes the translation will be like, along with me, God is in here. So that's, it seems like a really big deal, but practically speaking, it's not a big deal, whether at the highest level I'm God or I'm with God. It's actually not as big of a deal as it might seem to be. Because if I'm always with God, that's speaking as conscious mind. That I'm always in the company of God as conscious mind. I am. Or ultimately, I am the light. But still, what I'm taking myself to be is in relationship with it. If that makes any sense. So, but in this chariot, along with me, we could say like that, is the Supreme Soul, which also is the spectator, it's observing, the permitter, which is actually allowing or not allowing. Which is actually allowing or not allowing. So you may choose to do something that you want to do something, like lift that hand up, but it may not be permitted. And what would be the factor that would prevent it? Well, it would have to be a universal factor as well. Right? It would also have to be a universal factor. And so we could say, well, it's not permitted. But also, interestingly enough, you are the permitter. At a higher level, you are the permitter. So if we roll this back together, and then the enjoyer, but it's the permitter that I wanted to take a little bit of time with this morning. Then the enjoyer and the supporter, the great Lord and the Supreme Self. So supporter meaning the underlier, that which is supporting the action. In Christian tradition, Jesus would say, and in this case, Jesus is speaking in the same way that Krishna does. He's speaking as the highest, not as a separate person. And he says, you can do nothing without me. So he's actually saying the same, that I'm the doer, the Christ, or the absolute, or Purusha, the nature. The nature. I'm the doer, but you're the instigator. And I may or may not do what you want to do, but you're instigating it. And that's ego sense that's instigating. And ultimately, ego sense is the feeling of being separate, alone, and incomplete. Ego sense is the feeling of being separate, alone, and incomplete. And therefore, from that comes this agency, this feeling that I'm doing. That's also in ego sense. But if you look, as we've just done, you see I'm not doing. It might or might not happen according to my bidding. Right? Oh, go for it.
But if I could be the permitter, am I only the permitter once I'm letting go of my agency?
No, you're the permitter right now. In other words, you have the capacity to guide the course of action one way or another. You have the capacity, and this was the discussion. You have the capacity right now. Now there may be an overwhelming impulse. So you could turn this around and you could say the river is pulling your hand. So we had someone get stuck in the culvert the other day, and the river was pulling her leg very hard, very hard. So you could say that's a universal, and I wish to pull it out. I wish to pull it out, and then one or the other will happen. One or the other will happen. So you have free will, you have choice. Where it's most applicable as the instigator, and the instigator is also the permitter. Instigator is also the permitter. Now, at some level it's so. At some level it's so. Because the instigator, the ego sense, and really we're dealing with mental function. We're dealing with conscious mental function, which in the company of the ego sense becomes, we say, perverted, meaning I, me, mine. I need, I want, I'm going to get, I'm going to do this, I need the fruit for this, I need money, I need this, I need fame, whatever. That's all conscious mental function, but a perverted conscious mental function because that conscious mind has taken the ego sense to be the truth instead of the unity. And so it is an agent of action. It's not ultimately doing it. Only, as Christ would say, you could do nothing without me. So only the universal through the nature is actually doing. I'm not doing. But I get to choose what I wish to do or not to do. Now, I may have a lot of impetus one way or another. I may have my river being pulled downstream, my foot being pulled down the river. I may have this soul being pulled very strongly towards some perverse action or thought. Right? It may happen. But still, ultimately, I get to choose whether I wish to go that direction or not. Does that make sense? This is really my only power.
Is that free will?
That's free will. That's where we see free will at play. So I get to assert my will. Now, I may or may not ultimately have the fruit of it. Really, ultimately, I can't have the fruit anyway. The fruit belongs to the real doer, not to me as an individual. So it remains. That's the whole concept of tyaga that we were talking about also yesterday morning. The fruit belongs to the doer. It wasn't mine to begin with, and it isn't mine now. And so I need to renounce it because that's a silliness that I'm holding on to the notion of I get this for my doing. I didn't do. But I chose the course of action. I chose to try to lift the hand. Yes? I chose to try to come to the light. I chose to try to do what I was asked to do, or I chose not to try to do what I was asked to do. I chose to try to do the opposite of what I was asked to do. Now, ultimately, will I be able to do what I've chosen or not? That's a universal question. That's a question for the Lord, because the Lord is doing through all of this. Does this make sense? This is free will, and this is the discussion we wanted to have today, because the question will come, well, since I'm not doing, then what is this free will thing anyway? Is this helpful? Then what is this free will thing anyway? It's the agent of the action, and it's this factor of permitter. Now my ability to permit will also be high or low, related to the universal and the karmas, which are played out in the universal. But the ability to choose to embark upon a course of action is mine. That belongs to ego, or it belongs to the conscious mind in the company of ego, the jiva, the individual. Of course, only because of who he or she really ultimately is, but still, I have this ability. And where I wanted to go with this is just to tie this back, because there's a question. There's a question in ashram, and there's a question everywhere in life about what to do. What course of action do I choose? And what we've been dealing with is always this ego sense that I do in order to get something that will make me happy, or to avoid something that would cause me to experience pain and therefore deny my happiness. That's the ego sense. But in truth, happiness is an innate quality. Happiness is who you are. And so it's the ego sense, and any thoughts or speech or action underlain by the ego sense, being done, thought, contemplated, or spoken or acted out for me as a separate self, even subtly, to get something. And of course, the motivation to get something is really innocent. It's because all I want is to be happy. But you see, the way it works is nothing that you could ever get could make you happy. And nothing that you could ever avoid could make you unhappy.
But when we're got into the subtle, what we can get is enlightenment, which will make me happy.
You don't even get that. You just unveil it. No, I'm serious.
Right.
You have to see that. You don't even get that. You simply unveil it. So in a way, you decide to do what you're told by God, by the light. This is what you decide. And if you decide that, then you can have union. Now, the light functions in each of us, but we have to find it within us. Scripture takes us there. And I wanted to make this very specific point this morning. It's the role of scriptural injunction. And this is so important in ashram, and it's so important in everything else. And that is that God speaks to us inside, but God also speaks to us through the guidances about prescribed actions, what actions we should take, and proscribed actions, what things we should not do. Now, when we hear from the scripture, you should not do such and such. When we hear you should not do such and such, there's a doubting faculty that will arise and say, but I shouldn't just do what I'm told to do. I should understand what this means and why I should do it, because maybe I don't want to do it, or maybe it's not the right thing for me to do. Do you see that faculty arising is born of agency? And the notion that if I do the wrong thing, I'll be unhappy. And if I do the right thing, I'll be happy. You see that? That was the point for the morning. So what does that mean? It means that if happiness is a byproduct of peace of mind, which it is, happiness exists. The way to have it is to unveil it, and the only thing covering it up is the mind, and it's the mental stuff born of the ego notion. I need this, I need that, they need to do that. But none of that is actually true. What I need to do is get myself away out of my way. Which is what finally conscious mind in the company of ego will finally start to figure out. I need to get myself out of the way. Because all of this baggage that I'm bringing into the situation is just covering up what's real and what I've been seeking all this time, which is the beautiful message that you mentioned in terms of observing motherhood and how it flows unless you get in the way of it. And our situation is the same. And so we come all the way back to the prescribed actions and the proscribed actions. Prescribed, proscribed, which is where scripture actually says you should do this and you should not do that. Raja Yoga Sutras is perfect. So to the greater extent that we can understand, and by the way, Swami plays the role of Shastra here. So, in order to become enlightened, we need to have inner order. And in order to have inner order, we have to have self-control. We have to control ourselves, control our inner world. Because we have to bring the mind into a place of equanimity. And we have to free ourselves of the ego notion, of the feeling that we're separate, alone, and incomplete. All of this we can do. And there's a science that helps support us in doing that. And we're needing to recognize in the inner world who are our friends and who are not friends. And in the same way, in the outer world, who are our friends and who are not friends. So what we come back to, and I'll ask that all of the ashramites tune into this talk and really consider it and reflect upon it and that we discuss it. Because we deal with the situation, and we've been dealing with this ever since ashram started, where we will put a rule in place and we'll say, okay, do this, don't do that. But always, and we each deal with this, always this doubting faculty will raise, and it's fine. And then we might do a lot worse than just question it. We might do the opposite of what we're being asked to do, because that rebel is so strong. Thinking, this is in the company of the ego stuff, thinking that what I do is independent and it doesn't affect anyone else. And then we end up with one code of behavior when Swami's watching and a different code of behavior when Swami's not watching. And even when Swami's watching, but it's okay for me to think what I want because he doesn't see that. But he does. So we're wanting to go back to an understanding of how it is that scriptural injunctions are my friend. That's the intent of this today. How is it that acting in a certain way that's prescribed, if I don't want to, how is it that doing it is helpful? Because what doesn't want to is the whole agency, the whole baggage that we've been carrying around. And the way we've been living is doing what we want to do, but that's that ego sense that's been leading us all that time. But it keeps leading us out and down and not to what we really wanted to be in union with, which is that which is underlying the motherhood. Right? That which is perfect and pure. That which is your own highest self. And on the flip side, what not to do. Why? Because same reason. Because that rebel, it's okay. You want to ask questions. You really do. You want to understand. But ideally, you don't want to act until you understand. You don't want to follow that until you understand. Oh. Okay. Questions or comments on the discussion this morning? Is it helpful? Can you see where you are in this equation? Yeah. It helps us to see where we are even at different levels.
But when we feel like we're making some sort of progress,
yes,
it just gets more confusing.
Well, and sometimes, so we're always making progress. That's true. We are always making progress because we can't not, because we're learning. The great inventor, Thomas Edison, he was asked, how many times did you fail making the light bulb? And he answered, I never failed. I just learned millions of ways that it wouldn't work. And so you are. But then this aggregation, this ego sense, and the mind, conscious mind that's still tainted by it, that's still involved in doing in order to get, or not doing in order to avoid, when it's still in that, then we could say it's tainted. Then it can take credit for things that aren't its own, and it can also tell us, look at all the progress that I'm making. But in that way, it's a robber. It's a dacoit in Hindi or Sanskrit. Dacoit, false notion, etc. But you can tell if there's less anger, if there's less judgmental tendency, if there's less fear, then you can tell, okay, progress is being made. So you can tell. If there's more lightness in life, more ability to laugh at the mistakes and see them more as learning, then there's definitely progress being made. And so they're good signs. Feeling less separate. Even feeling someone's pain, you might say that's bad, but it's not. Feeling someone's pain actually genuinely where you'd hidden yourself from it before is also a good sign of the opening up. So, good introspection is our best ally. The ability to actually look inside and see God inside, absolutely. But also, in order to really get there, we have to see what we're working with in this psyche. And we want to do it non-judgmentally, right? You're not seeing something terrible, you're seeing a habit. And it's a habit that's veiling, not helping. And so, okay, let's clear that. And in the same way as the instigator or the agent, you say, we're going to clear this. And you communicate with the light and you ask for the help. In the same way that here you're communicating with the universal. You're not recognizing it that way, but that's what's happening. There's a communion there, a state of communion. And so just this happening, there's a relationship between the sense of agency and this. Oh, okay, we should close. Is that helpful? Okay, let's close with final prayers and arati. We'll have the short version, which is page 174. Om Chayambakam Yajamahe Sukhatim Pushtivardhanam Korvaya Nirvardhanan Richor Mukshayam Ritat. Om Chayambakam Yajamahe Sukhatim Pushtivardhanam Korvaya Nirvardhanan Richor Mukshayam Ritat. Om Chayambakam Yajamahe Sukhatim Pushtivardhanam Orvai Vakameva Bandhanan Ritor Musyamam Ritat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. O adorable Lord of mercy and love, let us abide in thee forever and ever. And let's stand for arati.